I have the pleasure to have this evening with us Professor Alessandro Vettori. Professor Alessandro Vettori is a friend of the Global Dante Project of New York, of the Casa Italiana, of the department, my friend too, and so I am particularly happy to introduce him. And Professor Vettori will give a lecture on Dante. I will give the precise title later, but I want just to stress that he is invited by the department, by me, by the colloquium in the humanities, which is a prestigious series of lectures we have created in 2007, at the time in which John Fracero was still with me, my colleague. In this series of lectures, we did have guests of every kind, but just, I would say, great scholars. So he is with us, and I am happy for that. I introduce him very shortly, giving just essential information. Alessandro Vettori is professor of Italian and Comparative Literature at Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey, where he currently serves as a graduate program director in the Department of Italian. His main research interests are autobiography, the rewriting of scripture in the Western tradition, the interconnection of literature and religion, the development of the concept of love, the history of the Medici of Florence. He has published a book on Franciscan poets of the 13th century entitled The Poets of Divine Love, Fordham University Press 2004, a monograph on Giuseppe Berto, La Passione della Scrittura, Marsilio Editore, Venice 2013. He has edited or co-edited 3 collections of essays, one on Boccaccio, one on Giuseppe Berto, and one on contemporary Italian poets. Has written articles on Dante, Boccaccio, Francis of Assisi, Jacopone da Tode, Giuseppe Berto, Diego Fabbri, Luigi Pirandello. His monograph on pilgrimage and prayer in Dante's Commedia is under consideration of the University of Arizona Press. At the moment, he is researching the donation of Constantino and its relation to Franciscan poverty for a future book project on this issue. Welcome, Professor Vettori, who will speak about Dante, Franciscan poverty, and the donation of Constantine. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria Luisa, for inviting me to this prestigious series of lectures, and I'm very honored to be here and to be talking about this project of mine, which, as Maria Luisa already mentioned, is quite new. I started working on this about a year ago. And as you can guess from her presentation, the project springs from my previous interests and my previous publications, particularly my interest in Franciscan history and Franciscan literature, and also on Dante. So at some point I thought I would combine these interests. And I thought that the donation of Constantine was the most obvious topic to analyze, because I'm hoping to show to you that it really is the link, or one of the links, an important historical link between Francis of Assisi, subsequent Franciscanism, and Dante. And I should really probably reverse the order of the title, and because I'm going to start with the donation of Constantine, explain a little bit the historical context in which the donation of Constantine came about, and introduce the issue, or just hint at the issue, of fake news that we're all very familiar with at the moment, because this is really what the donation of Constantine was. It's a forge, it's a fake document, and it's a fake document that really changed the course of history in a major way. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about about Franciscan poverty, and finally I am going to introduce Dante into this. So I mean, Dante is really peppered all over the talk, but I am getting to it more to Dante more specifically toward the end of the paper. So we all know how passionate Dante is about certain topics, and I'm sure you're all familiar with some of them, starting with Beatrice, to politics, the papacy, and his own exile. They all feature very prominently in his writings. One of them, I think, really sticks out in his writing. Few themes are as persistently recurrent as his condemnation of church corruption. And while Dante creates a safe distinction between the institution of the church and the clergy administering it, he never hesitates to expose the clergy's faulty behavior, especially when the people in question are popes. Dante's unmitigated hostility for Boniface VIII is well known. He blissfully announces his arrival in hell, Boniface's arrival in hell, even while Boniface is still living. But he also reprimands other popes, such as Nicholas III and Adrian V, for example. His love and respect for the institution urges him to reprehend those who subvert and undermine it with their corrupt behavior, especially with their wrongful and dishonest use of riches. The origin of this objectionable state of affairs is to be found in Constantine, the first Christian emperor who, while making Christianity a legal religion of the empire, also corrupted the church's initial combative spirit of martyrdom and set it on a declining, decadent course for the rest of its years. Constantine is to blame for the current strife between Pope and Emperor, and for the Church's insatiable appetite for temporal power. Dante blames Constantine repeatedly, adequately, for example, in Inferno 19. And I have the first quote here, where Dante finds the Simoniac popes. If you don't mind, I'm just going to read the Italian, and you can follow the English on the side. Ai Constantine, di quanto mal fu matre non la tua conversione, ma quella dote che da te prese il primo ricco patre. The semantics of familiar relationships, matre and patre, underscore the damage all the emperor's good intentions caused in subsequent centuries. In a passage that summarizes, in a very succinct way that probably only Dante is able to accomplish, the historical, juridical, and theological contingency at the root of it all. So, who was this Constantine who was guilty of bestowing riches on the poor, innocent, primitive church? And especially, what is this donation that he reputedly performed on behalf of the primitive church, and which is now, in Dante's time, in the late Middle Ages, the end of the 13th and beginning of the 14th century, considered as the origin of all evils? In Constantine's biography, fact and fiction are hard to distinguish. What we know for sure is that in 313, with the Edict of Milan, Constantine declares Christianity legal, and unofficially makes it one of the religions of the empire. According to the British historian Norma Baines, the Middle Ages begins with the gathering of cardinals at the Council of Nicaea in 325. And I quote from Norman Baines, this is the conclusion, basically the concluding sentence of his chapter on Constantine in the first edition of Cambridge Ancient History. Constantine, sitting amongst the Christian bishops at the Ecumenical Council of Nicaea, is in his own person the beginning of Europe's Middle Age. The Council of Nicaea is when the bishops determine the articles of faith in the Creed and unify an appeased and well-established church. This would sanction the ending of persecutions and the beginning of a self-reflective, centuries-long period of time during which the church spread, became spiritually stronger thanks to monastic institutions, and prospered doctrinally thanks to theologians who laid its dogmatic foundations. But this was also the end of the combative first period, which was filled with many heroines and heroes, its martyrs, in Greek literally its witnesses, the witnesses of salvation and church unity. The fictional part of Constantine's transmitted life story concerns the Emperor On's conversion, which supposedly happened when Constantine was suffering from leprosy and Pope Sylvester miraculously cured him, consequently being rewarded with the gift of the western part of the empire that he got in recognition for curing Constantine. The true story, though, is that Constantine only converted at the very end of his life, as was customary at that time, and was baptized, and this is the more awkward truth, by an Arian bishop, therefore heretical, Eusebius of Nicomedia in 337. And so Constantine would then be a heretical Christian who didn't believe in the divinity of Christ, but simply believed Christ was the Son of God and not God himself. And even more interestingly, I think, Arianism was denounced as a heresy at the very Council of Nicaea, which Constantine himself gathered and participated in. Closely related to the Sylvester legend is the quasi-hagiographical and quasi-juridical Latin document known as the Donation of Constantine, a document that was readily available to churchmen in the Middle Ages in any copy of Gratian's Decretum, at chapter 14 of the 96th distinction. In the 12th century, Gratian included the Constitutum Constantini, as the donation of Constantine came to be known, in his Decretum, which is the first comprehensive and systematic compilation of canon law. Later scholarship discovered the document to have been a forgery and to have been fabricated in the 8th century and to have been inserted into the Decretum, probably, very possibly not by Gratian, to validate it and give it legitimacy and authenticity. The Constitutum claims that on the day after his baptism, Constantine, as a solemn act of personal recognition of the Pope's authority, handed over to him the imperial insignia, including scepter, lance, orb, and various other ornamenta, and declared him the leader of the Western Empire. He also offered to place his imperial crown on the Pope's head, but the Pope refused to wear it above the clerical tonsure. For medieval popes, more than the authority to crown Roman emperors, the most important aspect of this document is the eternal possession of the Lateran Palace, which endowed the city of Rome to the papacy. The donation, of course, unleashes all kinds of theological and political complications, such as the clash between earthly and heavenly power, the Pope's authority as deriving from the emperor and not vice versa, and is in stark opposition to Christ's mandate for the foundation of a heavenly kingdom and not an earthly kingdom. The forgery was suspected for a long time before the document's authenticity before the document's authenticity was disputed on more scholarly grounds by Nicholas of Cusa from a purely theological point of view, and then more famously by Lorenzo Valla from a philological point of view. Valla made philological arguments that revealed its fakeness. We now know the Constitutum was composed in the second half of the 8th century between France and Italy, and was added to Gratian's Decretum, which was supposed to validate and legitimize it. Interestingly, even after Valla, some have insisted that the document may be invalid in the letter, but is nevertheless legitimate in the spirit. It took until 1874 for the church to acknowledge that this was a fake document. Tightly connected to the donation of Constantine is the debate on the poverty in the church, which had already been causing internal splits in Christianity, for example, with the heretical group called the Valdensians in the 12th century, and was already stirring controversy with the Franciscan radical movement of the spirituals. Dante witnessed in his lifetime the oscillating fortunes of the Franciscan order and its relationship to poverty. Matteo d'Acquasparta, who was general of the order, of the Franciscan order from 1287 to 1302, advocated certain relaxations of the rule prescribed by Francis. These relaxations were vehemently opposed by Ubertino da Casale, the leader of the spirituals. Under Pope Celestine V, the spirituals prevailed, and it was then that Ubertino da Casale wrote his Arbor Vitae Crucifixe Jesu, which Dante certainly knew, and in 1317, John the 22nd condemned the spirituals, and Ubertino was accused of heresy shortly thereafter in 1325. He transferred to the Benedictine order and soon afterwards completely disappeared. We don't even know where Ubertino da Casale is buried, in fact. In Paradiso 12, Bonaventure seems to want to find a compromise. Bonaventure, of course, the character in the comedy, seems to want to find a compromise between radical and relaxed interpretations of the rule of poverty, of the Franciscan rule of poverty, when he says, and I quote, «Ben dico, chi cercasse a foglio nostro volume, ancor troveria carta, u leggerebbe i mi son un chi soglio. Ma non fia da Casal né d'Acquasparta, là onde vegnon tali alla scrittura, c'uno la fugge e l'altro la coarta». C'uno la fugge e l'altro la coarta. The two contending sides on the Franciscan order appear to agree on a truce in Bonaventure's speech in Dante's Paradiso, which seems to indicate a possible compromise between the two opposing interpretations of poverty. Of course, it's totally fictional, right? It's Dante's own interpretation of it. Dante is a little less compromising, though, with Constantine, who bestowed riches on the church. In Purgatorio 32, when the eagle plunges on the chariot for the second time, the eagle leaves its plumage on it, as a symptom of transforming the chariot, the church, into an earthly kingdom. This is the very allegorical Canto 32 of Purgatorio, which has always been interpreted as the history of the church at the beginning, and the second plunging of the eagle onto the chariot is the passage I'm about to quote. Poscia per indi, ond'era pria venuta, l'aguglia vidi scender giù nell'arca del carro e lasciar lei di sé pennuta. E qual esce di cuor che si rammarca, tal voce uscì dal cielo e cotal disse, o navicella mia con mal se carca. Dante strongly believes the emperor does not have the authority to give away any part of the empire, because it is not his to give away or to divide. As he writes in Monarchia 3:10-5. To divide the empire is contrary to the office delegated to the emperor. For the duty of the emperor is to maintain unity of humankind under his authority, not to divide it. Dante argues, moreover, that the church was not entitled to receive the gift in the first place. And here he quotes Aristotle, who is the incontrovertible authority, when Aristotle proves that a gift is only valid if two conditions are met. The donor must be entitled to give the gift, and we have already seen that Constantine was not entitled to give the empire away, and the recipient of the gift is entitled to receive it. And this is in Aristotle's Ethics 4:1. The original point that Dante makes in Monarchia concerns the emperor, whose power comes directly from God, not from the church, so that the two institutions are parallel institutions, not one subjected to the other, and hence the poetic image of the two sons, I due soli, the son of the church and the son of the empire. The donation of Constantine may very well be a valid document. Dante, of course, had no way of knowing that philologically it was not, but it is nevertheless illegitimate, since the premises by which the donation happened are theologically and politically false. This is in Dante's view. Even in the middle of a highly philosophical and political argumentation as the division of powers between the Pope and the Emperor, Dante was thinking about the importance for the church to remain poor and pure, when in Monarchia 3:10-4 he quotes Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew 10:9-10. Nolite possidere aurum neque argentum, neque pecuniam in zonis vestris, non peram in viam, neque duas tunicas, neque calciamenta, neque virgam. Dignus enim est operarios cibo suo. Provide yourselves with no gold or silver, not even with coppers for your purses, with no haversack for your journey, or spare tunic, or footwear, or a staff, for the laborer deserves his keep. Just to reiterate Christ's command to keep the precept of poverty, here Dante also quotes the parallel passage to Matthew in Luke 22:35-36. Moreover, Dante doesn't believe that the church is entitled to receive the donation because of its entity as a poor institution of the spirit, not of the world. Even from the height of the second heaven in paradise, the poet doesn't miss the opportunity to argue, although indirectly, against the donation of Constantine. When the Emperor Justinian begins his long speech on the history of the Roman ego, he connects Constantine's decision to move the empire eastward from Rome to Byzantium, which now becomes Constantinople, since he names the city after himself, because this would counter God's plan that moves history westward, not eastward. And of course, here he quotes Aeneas as having moved the empire from the east to the west. Poscia che Constantine l'aquila volse contra il corso del ciel, che la seguio dietro all'antico che la vina tolse, that's clearly Aeneas, che la vina tolse, 100 e cent'anni e più l'uccel di Dio nello stremo d'Europa si ritenne vicino a monti dei quai prima uscio. Constantine didn't just cause the corruption of the innocent and persecuted church of the beginning. He also corrupted the natural course of history to move from east to west. Even when describing Constantine's blessedness in the eye of the eagle in Paradiso 20, Dante reiterates once again his point. L'altro che segue, that's Constantine, l'altro che segue con le leggi è meco sotto buona intenzione, So the intention was good. Sotto buona intenzione, che fe mal frutto, per cedere al pastor si fece greco. Ora conosce come il mal dedutto del suo bene operar non gli è nocivo. Avvegna che sia il mondo indi distrutto. Sotto buona intenzione. Given the context of the sixth heaven of Jupiter, Dante here is somewhat forgiving toward Constantine by assuming that his intentions were good, but he only points out the negative consequences of his action for the church, but also for history more in general. If wealth is synonymous with political power and corruption, Dante indicates that he believed in a poor church, for poverty equals purity. The debate on church poverty goes back at least 2 centuries before Dante's time, when Bernard Clairvaux preached in favor of poverty as the main reforming strategy for the Cistercians, his religious order, and against the accumulation of land and riches in the style of the Cluniac monks. Contrary to the Benedictine monastery of Cluny in France, the largest and most powerful in Europe until the beginning of the 12th century, which from an economic point of view relied heavily on rents, tithes, feudal rights, pilgrims going through on their way to Santiago de Compostela, the Cistercians, so Bernard Clairvaux's order, the Cistercians proposed a return to agricultural labor, the original means of sustenance for Benedictine monks as stipulated in St. Benedict's rule, which made them independent of all monetary exchanges and financial transactions that Cluniac life depended on. Cistercian monks worked the land in order to support themselves. They made their living from the sweat of their brow, not by piling up money and riches, just to use Dante's semantics when condemning usurers who don't earn their living by working, but simply make money from money. The contrast between the Cluniac monasteries and the Cistercian Reformation will culminate with the Cistercians supplanting the Cluniacs as the most important order by the end of the 12th century. Dante's stand in relation to the two orders is clear in the condemnation of Cluny, of Cluny in Inferno 23, where the hypocrites wear cloaks resembling those worn by the monks at Cluny. Laggiù trovammo una gente dipinta che giva intorno assai con lenti passi, piangendo e nel sembiante stanca e vinta. Egli avean cappe con cappucci bassi dinanzi agli occhi fatte della taglia che in Cluny per li monaci fassi. Di fuor dorate son, sicché li abbaglia, ma dentro tutte piombo e gravi tanto, che Federigo le mettea di paglia, o in eterno faticoso manto. Opposed to the hypocritical Cluniacs is the Cistercian Saint Bernard Clairvaux, whose role as the third guide in the comedy testifies to his importance in Dante's spiritual panorama. He leads the pilgrim to the vision of the Trinity, no doubt because he wrote a fundamental theological treatise on the Virgin Mary, and his prayer to Mary will allow the necessary intercession to disclose the door of the Trinity for Dante. But I would also argue that Bernard Clairvaux is assigned the crucial role to conduct the pilgrim to the vision of the Trinity, thanks to his indefatigable work as reformer of the Benedictine order, the Cistercians being newly devoted to poverty and detachment from corrupt means of earning money. Closer to Dante's time, poverty was reproposed no longer in the monastic tradition, but by the mendicant orders, in particular the Franciscans, who initiated a new chapter of church history when Francis undressed completely on the main square of Assisi to show his refutation of his father's mercantile work, and was received naked by the bishop of Assisi, representing the purified church renewed thanks to poverty. And I have an image, this is Sassetta's representation of that famous scene when Francis takes off his clothes and the Legenda Francescana specifies even panni di gamba, so he even took off his underwear. And he was completely naked to represent, he's the new Adam, right? He's the new pure and poor. Francis fought to purify the church, but never considered leaving it because it was corrupt. He went back to the gospel and rediscovered the message of liberation and salvation announced in its origin at the beginning of Christianity. This tug of war between the rich, powerful, and arrogant church institution and radical poverty proclaimed by the gospel and preached by the Franciscans comes to the fore in the struggle between a devil and Francis himself for the soul of Guido da Montefeltro in Inferno 27. Guido da Montefeltro was a condottiere, uomo d'arme, who gave up fighting, converted, and became a Franciscan friar. Pope Boniface convinced him to become his strategic advisor so that he could defeat the Colonna cardinals at Palestrina. Guido hesitated to return to his old ways, but was convinced by the Pope with the promise of absolution, which of course was a trick and a faulty theological argument. As the devil points out to him at death, to Guido at death, when he snatches his soul from Francis and takes him to hell among the evil counselors, you cannot absolve someone before they have committed a sin. And this is what the Pope made him believe, that he would absolve him even before he had committed the sin of evil counseling. This is how Guido concludes his narration in Inferno 27. Francesco venne poi, com'io fu morto, per me, ma un di neri cherubini gli disse, non portar, non mi far torto, venirsene de giù tra miei meschini, perché diede il consiglio frodolente, dal quale in qua stato li sono acrini. Ch'assolver non si può, chi non si pente, né pentere e volere insieme puossi, per la contraddizione che non consente. O me dolente, come mi riscossi quando mi prese dicendomi, forse tu non pensavi ch'io loico fossi? The passage is a direct attack against Boniface and highlights the grave consequences of an unscrupulous head of church. But the choice of a Franciscan as facilitator and enabler of a military stratagem allows the direct altercation between the devil and Francis, who thinks that he has come to collect one of his own. The devil as logician is a direct blow against philosophical sophistry, so that the Pope is accused of faulty argumentation, but likewise logicians are compared to devils, while the real victim is an innocent Franciscan who made the mistake of believing the Pope. Material riches and intellectual sophistication contrast Franciscan simplicity and purity in this final duel between Francis and the devil. Concerning Francis's pursuit of poverty for himself and for his order, several hagiographical texts show in allegorical terms, Francis's quest for a woman called Lady Poverty, whom he woos like a lover in the style of Provençal poetry. Far from being the beautiful, elegant, and richly attired woman Provençal poets pursued, Lady Poverty presents herself as a disheveled woman, dressed in rags, starved, but completely contented in her impecunious, destitute condition. In one of these texts, the Sacrum Commercium Sancti Francisci cum Domina Paupertate, Francis and his brothers want to be united with Lady Poverty forever, so they decide to seek her out and marry her. They embark on an expedition to find her. They climb a mountain, and undergo many trials and tribulations in the fashion of many romantic heroes or suitors until they find her. This very poetic narrative of Francis's love pursuit for Lady Poverty is an anonymous text whose dating is still debated. The majority of critics at the moment agree that it may have been written after Bonaventure of Bagnoregio's official biography of St. Francis, the Legenda Maior, after the 1260s or even the 1270s. Bonaventure died in 1274. This highly spiritual text is rife with biblical quotations and references to other Franciscan texts, and it is quite clearly inspired by courtly love literature with its topoi of Frauendienst, the protagonist being at the service of the lady, and her exaltation as milord, whose status is so far above the poet or the male protagonist that he cannot possibly even dream of reaching her as equal or loving her as a partner. Lady Poverty shows in her name the irony of inheriting a legacy of love and devotion for wealthy and beautiful women starting from the Provençal model, but reversing all the topoi of that tradition. She is ugly, she is dirty, she is uncombed, and she is dressed in rags. And yet, her description is not satirical. She would be comical if Francis and his companions were repulsed by her. On the contrary, they aspire to conquer her love and appreciation, and exactly because her qualities are the reverse of the earthly, mundane attributes of other women. In literary terms, this is an aesthetics of ugliness avant la lettre. Poverty in the Sacrum Commercium is also an allegory for wisdom, the quality that in biblical terms pre-existed everything and was God the Creator's companion in an empty universe before the creation of the cosmos. She also prepares the incarnation, as Francis reminds her when they encounter. Before he came to earth from his radiant homeland, you prepared an appropriate place for him, a throne upon which he would sit and a dwelling place in which he would rest. That is, a very poor virgin from whom his birth would shine upon this world. And having started with his birth, she follows Christ to his death and beyond. You were with him in the mockery of the Judeans, in the insults of the Pharisees, in the curses of the chief priests. You were with him in the slapping of his face, in the spitting, in the scourging. He who should have been respected by everyone was mocked by everyone, and you alone comforted him. You did not abandon him even to death, death on the cross. Dante conflates here the life of Francis and the life of Christ in Paradiso. Dante conflates the life of Francis and the life of Christ in Paradiso 11 and makes poverty the wife of both, first and second husband. Christ is the first husband and Francis is the second. Questa, privata del primo marito, 1100 anni e più, dispetta e scura, fino a costui si stette senza invito. Ne valse udir che la trovò sicura, con Amiclate, al suon della sua voce, colui che a tutto il mondo fe paura. Ne valse esser costante, né feroce, sicché dove Maria rimase giuso, ella con Cristo pianse in sulla croce. So Maria stays at the foot of the cross and poverty goes up with him. The detail of poverty accompanying Christ to his death, while Mary stays behind at the foot of the cross, seems to have been borrowed directly from the Sacrum Commercium. Although it is also present in Ubertino da Casale's Arbor Vitae, almost in identical terms of an opposition between poverty and Mary. Lady Poverty can and must be desired. She is an aspiration more than a presence. The Sacrum Commercium describes in full Francis's longing to attain her, and then narrates a symbolic wedding banquet made of a piece of stale bread and water drunk out of a broken cup. But in her essence, poverty remains unattainable, as shown by the long, divisive, and combative debate between the various factions of the Franciscan order to decide to what degree radical poverty was realistic and practicable. Lady Poverty is also geographically distant and difficult, almost impossible to reach. She lives on the top of a high mountain, and the friars climb for days before they can get to her. Her identity constantly shifts between the real, tangible presence and the diaphanous, eternal symbolism. For Dante, she is the Franciscan alternative to a corrupt church, and he adopts the spiritual and political ideal that will reform the church and purify it from within. However, he is also aware of the poetic value of the personification of a concept such as poverty, who for Francis is a lady in the style of Provençal poetics. Dante may have had this model in mind as he was forging his own lady, Beatrice, an unattainable woman he will honor at the summit of a mountain that is only partly an earthly mountain, and he will then enjoy her presence beyond space and time, oltre la sfera che più alta gira, beyond the highest turning sphere, as the ending of the Vita Nova describes her. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you for such a rich lecture. Interesting. And I think that perhaps you will give answer to a few questions.
I'll be happy to.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, Professor Villaset, your question. No questions?
I think that's one.
Yeah, thank you for this very interesting lecture. I was wondering, I don't know if you have looked at all into it, but I was wondering about the aftermath of Dante and what he says about the relation of Constantine in a later era of more, let's say, explicit spiritual trouble with the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation, where Dante, for example, in Protestant Catholics were sometimes considered as sort of proto-Protestant in some ways because they criticized the corruption of the church and its temporal power and its richness. So, but at the same time, of course, we have this idea of poetry that is connected with the monastic orders or medical orders. So I was wondering if you ever looked at all into it and if you had how these two aspects, Dante, but at the same time, institutions like the monastic orders that are dissolved, how these two things be combined.
Yeah, for sure, as you already said, Dante has been connected to the Reformation because of his stand, very clear stand against certain aspects of the institutional church that he condemns. And of course, as I pointed out, he's always very careful about distinguishing between the institution that he respects and the clerics that, of course, being human, are faulty and in a lot of cases corrupt. And so, of course, the Reformation is a product of its time. I mean, right? I think the fact that Dante privileges Franciscanism so much, at least in my reading, right? He privileges Franciscanism so much, makes it clear that he never really wavered about leaving the church, right? He was very clear about not staying within the church, as Francis was, even though for a long time, especially the spirituals were considered the margins, so they were considered as almost heretical, right, to a certain point, because of their stand for this radical poverty that they could not even define. I mean, they found it very hard to define themselves, because it's very hard to live a life where you can't even own a book. I mean, think of that. What kind of life is that? Without, and just to say, it's fine to have a use of things and objects, but not possess them. And so, what about the book of prayer? Am I allowed to own a prayer book, or not. So it was so radical that at some point they were considered idealistic, and so that was impossible to practice. Just to go back to your question, though, there are studies. I had a student do a project on Dante in relation to the Reformation, and there's quite a bibliography there, as Dante is a precursor of Reformed Christianity. Yes.
Yes. So I was wondering two things, very quick. First, why exactly the donation of Constantine came about in the context in which it was forced, if we know that. And secondly, how relevant it was in the debate that we see in the late Middle Ages, but let's say the 11th or 12th century. How relevant was in the struggle between the church and the emperors, or the church and the first kings, and for example, Philip IV? So was it used by the Pope? Was it taken seriously, or?
Yeah, it's a crucial question, right? So the donation of Constantine, the document, the Constitutum, the document that contains the donation of Constantine, was created in the second half of the 8th century. We're pretty sure about that, and we're even sure that it was under Pope Stephen II, so we're sure it was in the 750s, right? We're talking about the 8th century, 750s. 756, we could argue. Now, why did it come about at that particular time? It was a time when the Pope was creating an alliance with Pepin and Charlemagne's father, and it was very important for the Pope to have a document that confirmed that the western part of the empire was his to own, right? Because he was asking Pepin to defend his portion of land from invasions from the east and from invasions from the north. So historically, it's very clear why it happened at this particular time. So the interesting part is that it was created and then it pretty much disappeared, and no one really talked about it anymore for about 2 centuries until Leo, I think it's Leo III, mentions it in a letter in 1024. Don't quote me on the dates, but in the 11th century, beginning of the 11th century, maybe 1024, mentions it in a letter that he writes to the Patriarch of Constantinople. And that's how we know about it at first, right? That this document was known and was used. But it's interesting that for 2 centuries, it was never really mentioned at all, right? Now, when we come to, and that's the core of your question, when we come to the 13th century, of course, it was crucial to have something testify that the Pope was in charge of the western part of the empire, right? Because the strife between the Pope and the Emperor is daily, and therefore it's important to have something documenting the fact that the Pope is in charge. And this is what Dante really argues against, right? The Pope is not here to be an emperor, and that's his big argument. And so that's his criticism against the donation. Yeah.
Yes, sir. Did Pepin's famous letter to Pope Zacharias have something to do with the gendering donation of Constantine? When he said, who should be king? Should he who has the power be king, or should he who does not have the power be king?
I'm not really aware, but if the discussion is about who should be king and should be in charge, I'm sure that the donation of Constantine comes into it, one way or another. So I know it's an indirect answer, but I think that it must have something to do with it. If the power, temporal political power is mentioned.
Sorry,
Yeah.
When Lorenzo Balla actually determined that it was a forgery, do you know what was the first sign that you saw that might have given him that idea?
Yeah, so this is the beginning. I mean, here there are eminent philologists and classicists, so I hesitate to talk about this, but Valla's argumentation was mostly, as a philologist, was mostly semantics. So there were some very clear signs of wrong usage of words in that document. You know, there's no such a thing as fiefdom in the 4th century. And fiefdom was a reality in the 8th century, and words like that, right, that were, they could only be used in a much later period of time. Those were the first signs that there was something wrong with this letter. Mind you, this is 1440, and Nicholas of Cusa had already made the case that this was theologically an impossibility. It couldn't hold, right? It didn't make any sense theologically. And so there were lots of doubts that this was a legitimate document, or rather, there were lots of doubts that this was a valid, authentic document, but people still believed it was legitimate for the Pope to have temporal power. And so, as I mentioned before, it's you may believe that it's inauthentic, but it's still not illegitimate, right? Yeah.
It is always difficult to have a priority, but since you are the expert, if you had to choose between poverty, the criticism of the church, and love on the other side, which one is the strongest connection between Dante and Franciscanism?
So poverty or love?
Love.
Love. Oh, I like that question. I'm teaching a course right now. It's the history of love. It's a survey in the Italian literary tradition. It's a lot of fun, and the course is called Love and Sex Italian Style. So it has a lot of students in it, but the title lures students into this course, and then they figure out by the 3rd week that there is a lot of love and not much sex. So they stay in the class because it's too late to drop out. So I love that question. Now, so my point here is that I believe that Dante knew this this text, right, the Sacrum Poetic, and Maria Luisa told me that she agrees with this, which I love that, because if she agrees with me, I'm probably right. And if Dante knew this text, I hope I've shown you it contains a lot of different elements that he could have picked up. And I'm not saying that he used it and abused it, because of course this is not Dante, right? He made it better, if anything. He made it much better. But I would think, and I don't want to just be, compromising and say yes, this and that. I think probably both. So he finds there that this woman is a model for a woman that he's trying. Mind you, all differences considered, right? I mean, Beatrice is not ugly, disheveled, and no, none of that. But she's a poetic model that also corresponds allegorically to what he's trying to create. So he has both things, the literal and the symbolic at the same time. Yeah.
In the case of Guido Montefeltro, who he appears to be the victim in the altercation between the devil and St. Francis. However, he is still condemned to the 8th circle of hell for fraud, despite being a Franciscan. Why do you think it is that Dante does that?
You didn't necessarily go to heaven because you're a Franciscan. This is what he is clearly saying here. And I think the clear accusation is against Boniface, because Boniface used Guido's expertise and tricked him into this harm. I mean, this is so tragic. Every time I read this with my students, it's a terrible tragedy. He trusted the person that he could trust the most, right? He trusted the Pope. that he was going to get absolved from this terrible sin that he was committing. And then he dies thinking, I'm fine, right? I'm okay. Francis has come to pick me up. Francis is here. He's coming to pick me up. And the devil is there before Francis. And he says, no, sorry. Not sorry. He's happy. He's mine because didn't you know that I am a logician? So you have a lot of, it's a really convoluted passage, right? And from a critical point of view, there's so many different elements. And I believe, there's a criticism against philosophical sophistry, right? And a criticism possibly against Franciscans who were already teaching in Paris. And there was this huge debate, if you're a mendicant order, why would you go teach in Paris? You're supposed to go preach and be poor and not be in. So there is that, but there's also, I think, a very direct condemnation of Boniface's ways and how it's not simply political power. I mean, this is abusing souls, right? Clearly. So I think that's really what Dante is driving towards. And again, he is very, this is very Dante, right? You don't have to be Dominican, you don't have to be Franciscan. You can go to hell or go to purgatory or go to paradise. It doesn't matter which order you belong to. That's why the Cluniac monks are, of course, they're not condemned. They're not damned in hell, but the hint is very clear, right? The capes that he sees resemble the Cluniac capes. And there's a very specific reference there to Cluny, whereas the Cistercians are, Saint Bernard is a Cistercian, and Saint Bernard is the one who, not even Beatrice takes Dante to the vision of the Trinity, it's Saint Bernard. Yeah?
One more question, sir. The question was, within the donation of Constantine, and I taught this at City College in my own classes, there was something about a dream where Constantine was visited by the apostles Peter and Paul,
Yeah.
who actually told him to go to Sylvester and be cured.
Mm-hmm.
So that seems to be a conniving, manipulation of the papacy along the same lines as the donation itself.
Yeah, I agree. There's a lot in that dream, right? There's a lot in that dream because the dream is, Constantine has a dream, and this is typical. He has a dream, which is an inspiration, it's a prophecy, and in the dream, Peter and Paul come to him, and they say, this is not the way. You have to convert, and you have to convert the whole empire and turn the whole empire around and make this a legitimate religion. And so, but of course, the dream comes after we already know that Constantine was very conflicted because the way they were trying to cure him from leprosy was by killing a huge number of children and using the blood of these children to bathe him so that he could be purified. And so, you see what this is doing, right? It's about the legend that early Christians were actually doing infanticide. They were doing sacrificial rites, and so the narrative of the Decretum is exactly the opposite. It's blaming the pagans that wanted to cure Constantine by immersing him in the blood of the innocents. And so it comes, then the dream comes, and of course he's ready for this, right? Because he doesn't want to be accused of being an infanticide, and so he comes at the right time, and that's when he's convinced that he has to convert. What really strikes a lot of people as paradoxical is the fact that Dante doesn't really like this. He doesn't like the fact that the empire is converted, because he believes that the time of the persecutions was a time when the church was really alive, right? Because it had to defend itself. And then after it was legitimized, it became a well-established institution, and therefore it didn't have to fight for itself. And this goes against a lot of mystics and a lot of theologians who believe that, yeah, it's great that the church is legitimized, because now it can concentrate on establishing its dogmas, and that's when patristics came about, and including one of the Franciscans, Peter John Olivi, would believe that this is great. Donation of Constantine or not, the church is finally legitimate. But Dante does not go for that.
Thank you very much.
Okay.